All right, let me ask you something. What if I told you that a used airline ticket with your name on it might not actually prove you were on the flight? Sounds crazy, right? Well, today we're diving into a really bizarre legal puzzle where a simple fact gets all tangled up in what the courts basically call inadmissible gossip. So picture this. You're in a courtroom. The evidence? A used airline ticket, and it has the defendant's name printed right there. I mean, that feels like a slam dunk, doesn't it? It's gotta be proof they were on that plane. But what if it's not? And this isn't just some hypothetical thought experiment. This happened. In a real case, R.V. Rice, the prosecution had one simple job: prove that a man flew from London to Manchester. And their star piece of evidence was, you guessed it, a used airline ticket for that exact flight, with his name on it that they got straight from the airline. Okay, but this is where it all gets a little weird. Just the act of showing this ticket to the jury, it set off this massive legal debate. Something that seems like total common sense suddenly became this huge legal headache. And to figure out why, we've got to talk about one of the most, well, notorious rules in the entire legal world. That's right, we need to talk about hearsay. You've definitely heard it, shouted in a courtroom drama, "Objection, hearsay!" But what does that word actually mean? Well, it turns out it's the key to unlocking this entire puzzle. So here's the textbook definition, more or less. Hearsay is an out-of-court statement that's brought into court to prove that the statement itself is true. And let me tell you, courts hate this stuff. Why? Well, think about it. You can't cross-examine a rumor. The person who originally said the thing isn't there to be questioned, to see if they're reliable or just making things up. Now, the trickiest part of that definition is this phrase, to prove the truth of the matter asserted. So let's break that down with a quick example. If a witness says, "My neighbor told me the getaway car was blue," and they're saying that to prove the car was in fact blue, boom, that's hearsay. But what if the witness says, "I heard my neighbor scream"? They're not trying to prove why she screamed, just that a scream happened. That's not hearsay. See the difference? One is trying to prove a specific fact is true. The other is just proving that something happened. It's a really subtle distinction, but it's absolutely vital. Okay, to really see how wild and how strictly this rule can be applied, let's look at another classic case. This one's about a really clever car fraud scheme, and it involves some records that were, incredibly reliable. You'd think they would be perfect evidence, but, well, you'll see. So here's how the scam worked. First, the criminals would steal a nice, high-value car. Then they'd go find a cheap, totally wrecked version of that same model, just to get its legal identity, the paperwork, the visible ID numbers, all that stuff. Step 3, they swap those numbers from the wreck onto the stolen car. But here's the catch. There was one number they could never change, the one that was literally cast into the engine block when it was made. That number was the stolen car's real, unchangeable fingerprint. So for the prosecution, the entire case boiled down to proving this mismatch. They had to show that the engine number belonged to the stolen car, not the one from the junkyard. And really, the only way to do that was to get the manufacturer's own records. The master list that tracked every single engine and body number that ever came off the assembly line. And look, these weren't just some sloppy notes. These records were kept with military precision. They were the absolute definition of a reliable business document. Nobody doubted for a second that they were accurate. So, of course, they were allowed in court to prove the crime, right? They had to be. Nope, wrong. In a decision that just blows your mind, the highest court in the land ruled the records were inadmissible hearsay. And get this, here was their reasoning. They said the numbers written on those record cards were assertions made by some anonymous factory workers, guys who couldn't be dragged into court and cross-examined. So even though everyone knew the records were accurate, the court basically treated them like idle gossip from some guy on an assembly line. And this right here brings us to the absolute heart of the problem. This is the gray zone. What exactly is an assertion? When does a simple object stop being just a thing and start speaking a statement? To figure this out, we're going to look at a couple of other pretty wild cases. Okay, so this is a really famous old case. The whole thing was about whether a man who wrote a will was actually mentally competent, sane. To prove he was, his lawyers wanted to show the jury a bunch of letters that had been written to him by other people. And these were just normal, everyday business letters. The logic was pretty simple. You don't write serious business letters to a guy you think is insane. So the argument was straightforward. just the fact that these letters exist suggests the man was sane. But the court, they disagreed. They said the letters contained an implied assertion. It's like, by writing to him, the authors were implicitly saying, "We believe you are sane," even though they never wrote those exact words. And because you can't put an implication on the witness stand and cross-examine it, the letters were ruled hearsay. Unbelievable. All right, now let's jump to a much more modern example. Imagine a piece of paper is found near the scene of a robbery. All it says is, "Sean rules." And what do you know? The name of the accused is Sean. So the prosecution wants to use this note to connect him to the crime. So is this hearsay? Is the note trying to assert the fact that Sean does, in fact, rule? Well, in this case, the court said no, it is not hearsay. And this is such a great example of the fine line we're walking. The court's logic was that the note isn't being used to prove that Sean rules is a true statement. Who cares about that? Instead, the simple existence of the note is just a circumstantial fact. It creates what they called an inferential link. The jury can look at it and infer, hey, this was probably owned by Sean, or at least one of his friends. It's being treated as a physical object, not as testimony. Okay, so now that we've got this idea of assertion versus inference, let's circle all the way back to our original puzzle, that airline ticket in the RV Rice case. How do these two competing ideas play out here? All right, in one corner, you have the really strict interpretation. This comes from Justice Gibbs in a similar case. And his argument is that the ticket is only useful if you believe the name written on it is true, right? So the writing itself becomes an assertion by some unknown airline employee that a person named Rice is flying today. And since that employee isn't in court to be cross-examined, you know the drill. It's classic hearsay. But in the other corner, you have the argument that actually won the day in RV Rice. This view says, hold on, the ticket doesn't speak its contents. It's not a witness giving testimony. It's just a thing, a piece of physical evidence found in a pile of other used tickets for that flight. The jury can look at this object and use their common sense to draw an inference, exactly like they did with that Sean Rules note. And this is it. This is the key to the whole puzzle. The entire complicated debate really boils down to just one question of intent. What was the purpose of the writing on that ticket? Was it written down to assert a fact for some future court case, or was it just written to, let a guy get on a plane? So let's just lay it out, side by side. If the ticket asserts a fact, this person named Rice is a passenger, then it's hearsay. But if it's just an object, here's a thing used for travel that we found, then it's circumstantial evidence, and the jury can infer whatever they want from it. And in the end, the court went with the second path. They treated it as just a thing. And that really is what this whole thing is about. Look, the hearsay rule exists for a really good reason. We don't want people going to jail based on unreliable, untestable gossip. But if you apply that rule too strictly, like we saw with those car records, you can end up blocking evidence that is totally reliable and just defies common sense. It's this constant tug of war in the law. So that leaves us with a pretty big question, doesn't it? The law needs clear, rigid rules to make sure things are fair. But at the same time, justice completely depends on a jury's ability to just use their common sense to look at the evidence and draw a logical conclusion. This whole airline ticket puzzle shows just how incredibly hard it can be to find that balance. So I'll leave you with this. Where do you think that line should be drawn?